Welcome to Central Baptist Church Fellowship class, Sunday morning Bible study. We're studying the topic of where do Baptists come from. A kindergartner teacher gave her class a show and tell assignment. She asked each student to bring an object that represented their faith. So Benjamin stood in front of the class. He held up a Star of David and he said, "I'm Jewish." Mary stood up next and she held up a rosary and she said, "I'm Catholic." Tommy stood, "I'm a Baptist and I brought a casserole." Baptists are distinct from other denominations in many ways. They believe in salvation by grace through faith, without works, that is. They believe that the church should elect the pastor. They believe that each church is independent of other churches and the state and actually any entity at all. And Baptists get their name because, well, they're unique in that they immerse believers only when they baptize. Baptists believe in immersion for three reasons, at least. Number one, everyone in the New Testament who was baptized after they declared their faith in God. Second, the word baptized in the original Greek language means to dip. And third, Jesus was clearly baptized by immersion. This is in Mark chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. It came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And immediately, coming up from the water, he saw the heavens parting and the Spirit descending upon him like a dove. Now that's pretty plain, coming up from the water. One Greek text reads that he came out of the water. Either way, it's pretty clear that Jesus was under the water when he was baptized. And if we are to be baptized because Jesus was baptized, well, Baptists believe that we should be baptized like Jesus was baptized, though not necessarily in the Jordan River. The name Baptist is recent in historical understanding. We can trace its first use to 1522. Now, in a previous lesson, I may have traced it a little bit later than that, but since then I have been able to go back to 1522. Maybe in 2 more lessons, I'll go back even farther. But Baptists, even though we can trace the name to 1522, actually go further back than that. Let's look at some historians as they explain Baptist origins. The Dutch have been Baptists for many, many years, and they have some Dutch historians. We have many examples of them, but I'm only going to talk about 2. Dutch Baptist historians, J.H. Halbersma, that's hard to say because I'm not Dutch. It's hard to say if I weren't Dutch. Said, well, he was a minister and he was a linguist and a respected writer and died in 1869. This is what he said, and I quote, "The Baptists existed several centuries before the Reformation." The Reformation began in 1517, though it really wasn't a Reformation for a few years after that, but I'll explain that to you a little bit. J.J. Dermont, who was the chaplain to the King of the Netherlands, which makes him a pretty important fellow, and hopefully scholarly. He was the highest authority of the Reformed Church of his day. He was commissioned to undergo a study of Baptists, along with another fellow, and he studied Baptists in depth, and in 1819 he came to this conclusion, I quote, "Baptists who were formerly called Anabaptists, and in later times Mennonites, were the original Waldenses. Baptists who were formerly called Anabaptists, and in later times Mennonites, were the original Waldenses." Now the Waldenses we have traced definitely to 325, and Robert Barclay, a Quaker scholar, claims that they have apostolic, that they were around in apostolic times. Here's another quote from Dermont. "Baptists may be considered as the only Christian community which has stood since the days of the apostles. So, Dermot puts them at the apostolic days, just like Barclay. Those are a couple of Dutch historians. Let's look at some English Baptist historians. Adam Taylor, who wrote The History of English General Baptists in 1818, said this: "In all ages there have been Baptists." R.B.C. Howell, who wrote The Early Baptists of Virginia, published in 1857, said, "The prevalence of Baptists in Britain from the earliest times, and in no small numbers, will be questioned by no one who is at all familiar with the religious history of our fathers." Now, having read those quotes, studied these people, and all of the things that we have studied up to this time, I think we can make 4 definite conclusions. Number 1, churches with Baptist distinctions have been with us since the early times, since the apostles. Churches with Baptist distinctions have appeared throughout history since the time of the apostles. Number 2, many churches were often Baptist by another name, like Anabaptists or Waldenses. What I mean by that is their practices and their doctrines were similar, if not identical, to modern Baptists. Number 3, the name Baptist did not appear until the early Reformation, that is, not in print. We know that it was in print in 1522 because there's a famous letter that was written by people who claimed to be Baptists and sent, in which they named themselves Baptists. 1522 is an important date because it was in 1521 that Martin Luther was excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church. In 1517, he nailed the 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg, Germany, declaring his opposition to the Catholic Church and requesting a debate over these 95 issues in which he differed with the Catholic Church. That's technically the beginning of the Reformation. But for many years, Martin Luther and the church went back and forth trying to work things out. And it wasn't until 1521 that the Roman Catholic Church excommunicated him, threw him out of the church, and he was on his own. And it was sometime after that that he began the Lutheran Church. So, if the Baptists were around in 1522 by name, and Martin Luther was excommunicated the year before, that's pretty strong evidence that the Baptists by name existed before the Reformation. Well, that was number 3. Number 4, Baptist churches did not come from the Reformation. They existed before the Reformation, both in quality of church and by name, Baptist. Now let's look at some Baptist churches who actually use the name Baptist. Let's look at some English Baptist churches, okay? Because it's easiest for us to trace Baptist churches who spoke English. And we'll begin with the ministry of a fellow by the name of John Smith. You may have heard of John Smith. He was originally an Anglican. That is, he belonged to the Church of England in England, which split off of the Catholic Church under Henry VIII. So it was the official Church of England, and Henry VIII, at the beginning of it, was the official head of the church. He broke off with Anglicanism because he was disillusioned by it, and he began his own congregation in 1606, and it was based on the principle that only believers should be baptized. Obviously, he was persecuted, and because he was persecuted, he was forced to go somewhere else, and he chose the Netherlands. He took a small group with him, and when they got there, they baptized one another as believers. Some of his followers eventually joined the Mennonites that were in the Netherlands, and John Smith intended to do that, but he died first. And after he died, and after some of them joined the Mennonites, Some of them returned to England. Some, exactly 10, returned to England. They returned to England under the leadership of Thomas Helwys. Thomas Helwys led those who returned and became their pastor. They began a Baptist church in London between 1611 and 1612. They were the 10 members that had broken off of Smith's church and come back to England. Many of their persecutors called them, curiously, Anabaptists. They called themselves Baptists. And then the Baptists did what Baptists are famous for. They split. They split into two groups, the General Baptist and the Particular Baptist. And people of these persuasions are still with us today. And so, depending on what you think, you should be careful what church you attend or what pastor you call. So let's talk about them. General Baptists. General Baptists were here first. They were followers of Helwys. Their doctrine was pretty simple and pretty Baptistic. They believed in free will. That is, that you may call upon the name of the Lord and be saved of your own free will. Nobody is forcing you to do it. God is not forcing you to do it. Of course, they believed in believers' baptism. Only those that have made a profession of faith should be baptized. And of course, it was by immersion. And they believed that the church elects the pastor. Other beliefs that we'll not mention, you can look those up for yourself. Those are General Baptists, because they believe that Jesus came and saved the entire world, and whosoever shall call upon him shall be saved. Particular Baptists, though, are a little bit different. They were formed by a preacher by the name of John Spilsbury. John Spilsbury formed his church in 1638. And he broke off of the Free Will Baptists, not free will, that's a different kind of Baptist, but Baptists who believed in a free will. And his doctrine was similar in many respects. He taught believers' baptism. Only those that have made a profession of faith should be baptized. And he wrote a lot about what he actually believed. You can look it up on the internet, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all these things that he actually believed about doctrine and also about the church and what constituted a legitimate church. But he differed from General Baptists in that he believed that you are predestined to be saved or you're not predestined to be saved. What that means and what he meant was that before the foundation of the world, before God ever created anything in our universe, God decided who would be saved and who would not be saved. And you don't have a will in the matter. You will just be saved, or you won't be saved. Which means that you can call upon the name of the Lord all you want. If you're not one of the elect, you won't be saved. And you can never darken the doors of a church in your life. But if God has called you to be saved, you will be saved. Of course, they believe also that a person who is saved will act like a Christian. So they believe in predestination and election. Now, these two types of Baptists are still with us today. And it's not always obvious what different Baptists believe on this issue. So what that means is you might attend a Baptist church and the pastor or the visiting preacher might believe in predestination and election, and you would never know. Or you might believe in free will, and you might not know. A church might have a pastor that believes in free will, and he resigns and goes to another church, and they might elect another pastor, and that pastor might believe in predestination and election. So, what you should be careful of, if you have an opinion on this, is to make sure that you sit under the person that agrees with you on this, unless, of course, it doesn't matter to you, in which case it really doesn't matter. But there's two types of Baptists, general and particular, and as far as I know, they're not called that anymore at all. Of course, England colonized America and exported the Baptist church from their shores to the American shores. Next week, we're going to look at American Baptist churches. Thank you. May God bless you.